I knew something was off the second I heard the bulldozers. It was a Tuesday morning, just past 8, and I just poured my coffee when the ground started vibrating like a low growl under my boots. I stepped out onto my porch and saw two yellow machines rumbling their way down the slope behind my property, straight toward the creek. My name's Tobias Marden, and that creek has run behind my house for as long as I've lived here, 15 years. It's part of my land and it's fed by a natural spring up the hill. I built a small dam years ago to create a peaceful little pond. My daughter Ellie used to catch frogs there. Now she's off at college, but that creek's still mine. I stormed down the hill, boots half-tied, coffee sloshing over my knuckles. There, standing with her hands on her hips and a laminated clipboard in hand, was Deborah Fielder, the queen bee of the High Ridge Meadows HOA. Platinum blonde bob, tennis visor, and that smug, pinched expression she always wore when exercising her authority. "Deborah," I barked. "What the hell are they doing on my land?" She didn't even flinch. "Tobias," she said, voice syrupy and fake, "this area is being repurposed for additional parking. The board approved it last week." I blinked. "That's private property, that's my creek." She flipped a page on her clipboard like it meant something. "Actually, the board reviewed the original platting documents. Turns out that back portion of your lot was improperly zoned. It's common land." "That's a lie," I said. "I've got the deed. It's mine." "Well, then you can take it up with the county," she said, turning on her heel. "In the meantime, construction begins today. We have a community event next month and we need overflow parking." I stood there, watching as they started paving over the creek. Trees ripped out. Mud churned. The dam held for now, but I knew it wouldn't for long with all the ground pressure. I went back inside, heart pounding. I wasn't just angry, I was boiling. That night I pulled out every document I had. The original survey, the deed, the photos of Ellie fishing by the pond when she was 6. I called the county. They confirmed what I already knew: my property line extended past the creek. But when I mentioned the HOA's construction, the guy on the phone sighed and said, "You'll probably have to get a civil lawyer involved." And that's when I realized something wasn't adding up. Deborah and her board didn't just accidentally misread the zoning. They were counting on the fact that I wouldn't fight back. They thought I'd roll over like everyone else in the neighborhood. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I started documenting everything. Drone footage, timestamps, even soil displacement. And every day after work, I'd walk the perimeter of the new lot and quietly shake my head as they paved over more of my creek. They installed bright white lines, handicap spots, even a sign that said reserved for HOA board. But I had something they didn't: the dam. And a plan. I waited until Friday. By then, the lot was finished. Fresh lines gleamed under the sun, and a crew had even installed solar lights along the edge of the pavement. The whole thing reeked of arrogance. Deborah and her board had a ribbon-cutting ceremony planned for Saturday morning. I overheard one of the contractors say they'd even ordered a custom banner, but I wasn't the only one with questions. Thursday night, I paid a visit to my neighbor, Russell. Retired firefighter, Vietnam vet, and one of the few people on our street who never bowed to the HOA. He'd been keeping to himself since they fined him for flying a slightly oversized American flag on his porch. I knocked once. The door opened before I could knock again. "I saw what they did," he said, leading me in without asking why I was there. "Didn't think they'd be dumb enough to touch that creek. They claimed it was common property," I said, setting down the thick folder of documents in my arm. "But the county confirmed twice that it's mine." Russell took a seat, pushed aside a stack of old hunting magazines, and tapped a cigarette from a tin. "That's not just civil, Tobias. If they knew it was your land and still built over it, that's criminal trespass. Especially with heavy machinery." I nodded. "And I've got drone footage, timestamps, contractor names, and a copy of the HOA's board minutes. They never mentioned reviewing original plats. Deborah fabricated that." He leaned back. "Then you've got them, but don't just sue." "Make it hurt." "I plan to," I said, pulling out a sealed envelope. I'm filing a temporary injunction tomorrow, but in the meantime, I'm going to remind them what they built over. Russell raised an eyebrow. You're opening the dam, not all the way, I said. Just enough to send a message. That night, I put the plan in motion. I rechecked every valve, every channel I'd installed years ago when I reinforced the dam for winter runoff. I designed the system to handle heavy flow, but it could also be rerouted temporarily down a backup spillway that passed beneath the clubhouse lawn. The same clubhouse where Deborah kept her office, where the HOA stored their archives, hosted meetings, and held their precious brunches. At dawn, I opened the first valve. Water surged, not in a destructive torrent, but enough to swell the runoff channel and soak the newly paved lot. By 8, the lower edge of the asphalt was submerged in 6 inches of muddy creek water. Lawn chairs floated. The solar lights flickered and popped. The clubhouse's back patio was a swamp. At 8:30, Deborah called the sheriff. I was already waiting when the deputy arrived. I had my deed in one hand and a copy of the county's zoning map in the other. Deputy Langford stepped out of his cruiser with a clipboard and a weathered expression that said he didn't want to be part of this mess. He walked straight past Deborah, who was waving her arms and pointing at the water, and came up to me. "You're Tobias Marden," I nodded. He flipped a page. "Your name's on the deed. County confirms the zoning. So far, I'm not seeing anything illegal, but the HOA's claiming you damaged their property." I pointed to the water still rushing under the clubhouse deck. "They built on my land. I'm redirecting water that's naturally mine. The dam is within my boundaries. What they're calling damage is the result of illegal paving." He scratched his chin. "You got proof they knew it was your land?" I opened the folder and handed him a printed email. "This is from Deborah to the contractor. She acknowledges uncertainty about the property line but tells them to proceed anyway." Langford read it twice. Then he looked over at the parking lot, now rippling under a sheen of brown water. "I'm going to recommend both parties get legal counsel," he said, handing me back the paper. "But off the record, I'd say you've got a strong case." Deborah stormed over, heels squelching in the mud. "You're just going to let him flood the community," she snapped. Langford didn't blink. "You paved over his creek, ma'am. The water's going where it's always gone." "You don't understand," she hissed. "We had approval." Langford tilted his head. "From who?" She hesitated. "The board." "That's not how property law works," he said flatly. "If you knowingly built over private land, you're liable. And if that email's real, you may be looking at fraud." Her face drained. By noon, the clubhouse was closed due to water damage. By mid-afternoon, I had a signed affidavit from the county's zoning officer confirming my property lines. But it didn't stop there. I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. That weekend, Russell and I held a cookout on his lawn. No permits, no HOA approval. We invited the whole street. Over burgers and lemonade, people started swapping stories. Maria, 3 houses down, said she'd been fined twice for planting non-approved tulips. Brian, a single dad, said they'd threatened to tow his truck for excessive wear on the street. Gloria, who ran a daycare from her home, said Deborah had tried to revoke her license by filing a false complaint with the city. I offered them something they hadn't had in years, a way out. "I'm filing a class action," I said, passing around a clipboard. "Civil trespass, property damage. Abuse of authority. If you've been targeted, sign on." By dusk, I had over 20 signatures. Monday morning, I filed the injunction. The court granted it within hours. HOA construction was frozen. The parking lot was officially deemed encroaching, and the clubhouse was under investigation for unpermitted development. Deborah tried to rally the board. But 2 members resigned. Another flipped and started cooperating with the county inspector. Turns out, Deborah had been waiving fines for her friends, misusing community funds, and pushing through projects without a quorum. The flood hadn't just damaged the parking lot. It broke the dam on everything she'd been hiding. The courthouse in Millersburg sat on a hill that overlooked the town square. And from the 3rd-floor civil clerk's window, You could see all the way to the Highridge Meadows sign at the edge of our neighborhood, the same sign Deborah had spent $5,000 of HOA funds to redesign last year without a vote. Now, I was sitting across from a judge who had just signed an emergency restraining order against the HOA's further development. Judge Rollins was a man of few words, but even he raised an eyebrow when he read through the complaints. They paved over a live waterway on a private parcel without permits or survey documentation, I nodded. And they did it after being warned. I have the contractor's signed work order and Deborah's email authorizing it. He set the papers aside. And you say members of the board knew the boundary dispute wasn't resolved. 2 have already resigned. 1 turned over meeting recordings. There's an audio file where Deborah says, and I quote, "No one checks plat maps. If we act fast, we can claim it's a community asset." He leaned back, took off his glasses, and stared out the window. If what you're saying holds up, we're talking fraud, not just civil overreach. That afternoon, I was contacted by an assistant district attorney from the county prosecutor's office. Her name was Natalie Chen, and she wasn't calling to chat. "I reviewed the injunction and the supporting documents," she said on the phone. "We're opening an investigation into the HOA board for potential criminal misconduct." The moment she said that, I knew the tide had fully turned. While the legal gears started turning, I kept working with the neighbors. Gloria offered her garage as a temporary meeting space. Brian brought folding chairs. Maria printed out flyers titled "Know Your Rights, Property, Permits, and the HOA." We weren't just fighting back, we were organizing. The tipping point came when the cleanup crew showed up at the clubhouse with hazmat suits. The water I'd released hadn't just soaked the grounds. It had seeped into the storage room where Deborah kept documents, most of which were now molded over or stuck together in soggy lumps. A city inspector arrived the next morning and declared the structure unsafe for gatherings due to compromised electrical wiring and saturated foundation supports. That same day, Natalie showed up in person. She asked to meet at my place, and when she stepped onto my porch, she was already flipping through a leather-bound notebook. "You were right about the email," she said without preamble. "We got a warrant for the HOA's server." The text pulled up the metadata on the board communications. She handed me a printout. It was a spreadsheet of fund transfers. Deborah authorized payments to a shell company registered in Nevada. It's listed as a landscaping vendor, but it's got no employees and no tax filings since it was founded. Over $80,000 moved through it in the last 18 months. I stared at the numbers. "Is that embezzlement?" "It's shaping up to be more than that," she said. She used HOA funds to pay a company she owns under an alias. That's wire fraud. And if she signed those contracts knowing they were fake, we're looking at falsified public documents. We both looked toward the hill where the clubhouse sat, now surrounded by orange hazard tape and a sagging deck. Natalie continued, "We'll be issuing subpoenas to the remaining board members. In the meantime, we're recommending the county place the HOA under administrative supervision until a new board can be elected." I didn't know that was even possible. Apparently, neither did Deborah. That evening, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up her driveway. The deputy walked her out in cuffs, while half the neighborhood watched from their porches. No one said a word. She tried to keep her chin up, but her shoes sank into the mud along the edge of her ruined parking lot. The local news showed up the next day. A reporter named Cassidy Banks interviewed me in front of the creek, where the water was now flowing clean and clear again. "So, Mr. Marden," she said, "what made you take action?" I looked at the water, then back at her camera. "This isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. Legal, physical, ethical. You let someone cross one and they'll keep going until you stop them." She nodded and turned to the camera crew. "You heard it here." A quiet creek becomes the flashpoint of a scandal that's rocked one of Millersburg's most exclusive communities. I didn't care about the headlines. What mattered was what happened next. With the HOA under county supervision, a temporary trustee was appointed to oversee operations. He was a retired city planner named Harold Beck, and he didn't waste time. The first thing he did was issue a full audit of the HOA's finances. The second was to suspend all fines issued in the past year for review. The third was to hold an emergency town meeting open to every resident. It was held in the park across from the old clubhouse. Folding chairs, a portable speaker, no banners, just Beck, a microphone, and a stack of paper ballots. "We're holding a vote," he said simply. "You'll elect 5 interim board members. They'll serve until the end of the year. During that time, we'll restructure the bylaws and propose amendments to prevent this from ever happening again." Gloria nominated Russell. Maria nominated me. Brian nominated himself. We all won. The first order of business. Repealing the clause that allowed the board to issue fines without a supermajority. The second. Hiring a licensed surveyor to redraw and publicly verify every property line in the neighborhood. The third, passed unanimously, was to repurpose the ruined parking lot into a community garden. The creek stayed right where it belonged. One morning, a few weeks after the vote, I was back down by the dam, checking the sluice system. Ellie had come home for a long weekend, and we were planning to plant some fruit trees near the pond. She stood beside me, her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the water that once held her childhood frogs and now held the memory of the fight that saved our neighborhood. She nudged me. "You didn't just protect the creek, Dad. You gave them their spine back." I didn't say anything. Just nodded and looked at the land. It was never about just water or fines or parking lots. It was about people remembering they have the right to stand their ground, to speak up when something's wrong. To remind those in power that titles don't make you right, actions do. By mid-April, the last of the mold-stained carpet had been ripped from the clubhouse. The county had fenced off the structure entirely, pending demolition, and the temporary trustee, Harold Beck, had begun holding open forums twice a week on folding chairs beneath the pavilion in the park. No podiums, no titles, no closed-door decisions. The new interim board had started meeting in Russell's garage, which now resembled more of a war room than a workshop. Folding tables lined in neat rows, each covered with legal folders, spreadsheets, and copies of the old HOA bylaws marked up in thick red pen. A whiteboard stood in the corner with a growing list of statutes slated for repeal. Every meeting, we crossed off another one. But something had been bothering me. At first, I thought it was just about fixing the damage. The broken trust, the ruined creek, the fines that had bled people dry. But the more I reviewed the records, the more I realized there was something deeper, something carefully buried. I brought it up one evening while we were reviewing vendor contracts. "Has anyone looked into the insurance claims?" I asked, flipping through a manila folder that reeked faintly of mildew. The old board filed damage reports after the flood. But they backdated them. Brian looked over from where he was tallying refund amounts. Backdated? Yeah. The reports time-stamped 3 days before the flood. Lists water damage to the clubhouse, equipment loss, and even quotes for repair before the valve was ever opened. Russell stood up, his chair scraping. That's insurance fraud. If they claimed damage before it happened, they were trying to cash out. I nodded. And guess where the reimbursement checks were mailed? Gloria pulled her glasses down and leaned over the folder. Don't tell me P.O. Box in Knoxville belongs to a company called Bramble Creek Holdings. Maria, who'd taken over reviewing the HOA's financial ledgers, turned pale. That's the same account Deborah used for the landscaping invoices. That night, I drove to the county records office. It was off hours, but I knew the clerk, a guy named Landon I'd coached in Little League years ago. He let me in under the condition I didn't tell anyone he still kept red vines in his desk drawer. I pulled every corporate filing tied to Bramble Creek Holdings. It was registered to a man named Curtis Fielder, Deborah's brother. A real estate attorney out of state suspended for malpractice 2 years earlier. The next morning, I called Natalie Chen. "I think we've got another layer," I said. "Deborah wasn't just embezzling. She was laundering reimbursements through her brother's business. Natalie didn't hesitate. Fax me everything. If there's a paper trail connecting the insurance fraud to a suspended out-of-state lawyer, we escalate this to federal. By the end of the week, the FBI had requested copies of all HOA financial records for the past 5 years. Natalie handed over everything with a letter of support from the county supervisor. 2 agents showed up the following Tuesday. They wore plain clothes and drove an unmarked SUV, but no one missed the way they walked through the neighborhood with notepads and stern eyes. They spent 4 hours in Russell's garage, reviewing files, then made a stop at Deborah's old house. She wasn't home, her car was gone, her lawn overgrown, and the mailbox stuffed with unopened mail. According to the agents, she'd skipped her last court appearance and stopped answering her attorney's calls. A warrant was issued for her arrest. It took another week to locate her. She'd been staying under her maiden name at a short-term rental in Charleston, using a prepaid debit card and a burner phone. The FBI picked her up during a morning jog. According to the agents who brought her back, she didn't say a word the entire 6-hour drive. With her extradition came a cascade of charges: mail fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit theft, and obstruction of a public investigation. Her brother Curtis was indicted separately. The news made national headlines by Thursday. HOA Queenpin faces federal charges in Creek scandal, the headline read. The photo showed her being escorted into the courthouse in a gray hoodie, sunglasses perched on her forehead, looking anything but in control. But that wasn't the final chapter. With the fraud exposed and the case moving to federal court, the neighborhood turned its focus to rebuilding. Not just the land, but the spirit of the place. The parking lot was ripped up in early May. The asphalt came up in thick black sheets, revealing the cracked soil beneath. Volunteers from the entire neighborhood showed up to help restore the creek, planting native grasses and hauling in stones to stabilize the banks. Ellie came home from school to help lay down the first row of stepping stones. "This place looks taller," she said, adjusting her gloves. "Like it's breathing again." The community garden went in next, raised beds filled with tomatoes, herbs, and strawberries. A rainwater catch system was installed where the old clubhouse deck had collapsed. Russell built a compost bin from reclaimed wood, and Brian's daughter painted signs for each vegetable row in bright, blocky letters. At the final open forum before the interim board's term ended, Harold stood up and passed the microphone to me. "I think Tobias should close this one out," he said. "It's only right." I took the mic, looked around at the faces in the crowd. People who'd once waved from behind hedges now sat side by side. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now shared tools and recipes. There was laughter, even applause. "We didn't just survive this," I said. "We learned from it. We proved that titles don't make leaders' actions do, and when people stand together, no amount of fraud, threats, or concrete can bury the truth for long." The vote to ratify the new bylaws passed with unanimous approval. The new rules required all board meetings to be publicly posted and recorded. Any expenditure over $500 now required a neighborhood vote. No board member could serve more than 2 consecutive terms. And most importantly, any changes to land use required notarized consent from all affected property owners. The HOA was still there in name, but it no longer resembled the machine Deborah had built. It had become a tool again, not a weapon. On the first morning of summer, I stood by the creek before sunrise. The water flowed steady and clear, frogs croaked just beneath the rush, and the soft glow of solar lanterns lit the edge of the garden across the slope. Ellie joined me, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You ever think it'd get this far?" she asked, handing me one. I took a sip. "I figured we'd fix the lot, maybe get a refund or 2. I didn't expect federal indictments and a full neighborhood revival." She smiled. "You built something better than a dam, Dad." We stood there in silence, watching the water trickle past the stones we'd laid together. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was protecting something. I felt like I was part of something worth protecting.